Thank you, Professor Mohammed Zaki, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. My name is Helen. Very delighted to be here. I'm currently a third-year PhD student at the Cambridge Service Alliance, which is part of the Institute for Manufacturing here at Cambridge. So over the past 3 years, my research has largely focused on this notion of service design principles, and specifically how it intersects with novel technologies such as generative AI. And so over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to briefly talk about some of our research that we've done at the CSA, share a little bit of our preliminary findings, and then really to share a little bit about how we're bridging practice with the research that we're doing here at the CSA. So before getting into the AI, I just wanted to make sure that we're aligned on what service design is. Right, so if you ask a million different people, you're probably going to get a million different answers on what really is service design. And for this session's purpose, we're going to be defining it as a human-centered, systemic approach to shaping how services are experienced, delivered, and organized. It's essentially fundamentally dealing with the shaping of experiences and interactions rather than products, as you'd see in product design. It takes a holistic approach that considers both our customers and the organizations that are delivering services in order to create outcomes. And so we defined it, or according to Kimball, we wanted to put this mainly through two streams. So first of all, we have the design for services, which is really about creating the conditions that enable people to create value. And then we also have the design of services, which is about the micro elements. So how we're deliberately constructing those various systems, processes, and facilitating across touch points in order to deliver those outcomes. So fundamentally, it's really about the interaction between actors within the service system. And so one of the other things that I wanted to point out was that, service design is fundamentally anchored in this notion of design thinking. And one of the definitions that we'll be using here is defined across 4 stages, which are discover, define, develop, and deliver. So what really is the problem, right? So I think back in 2022, more people were starting to interact with GPTs. We were able to see a increase in the productivity in which people were able to immediately see through the work that they were doing. And then back in, I think, 2025 or 26, more reports started coming out. And what these reports indicated was that actually 95% of Gen AI pilots fail. And this is a very surprising result because it's not 50%, it's not 70%, it's up to 95%. What was going on was that practitioners were really struggling to move beyond kind of generative AI service concepts into those prototypes and then into further the production. Over 80% of these initiatives were not seeing measurable outcome. And so only a mere 5.5% of them were able to see real returns from their service design efforts. Only 34% of these practitioners were actually reimagining services altogether, which meant that most teams were actually just integrating and embedding Gen AI as kind of a tool within their workflows instead of completely reimagining the service design or the delivery model. So something very interesting that they found was also that they measured 25 attributes. So some of these attributes could include, for example, which leaders were governing their AI, or some of the measures that had been taken as a result of the AI boom, such as reducing headcounts, or could be completely redesigning different kind of roles. But what was found was that the redesign of workflows actually had the biggest effect on the organization's ability to see EBIT impact directly from generative AI. And so I think this really speaks a lot in that the problem really is not the technology itself, but rather how we design them with the technology. So what were some of the Gen AI applications that we're seeing across the design processes? So across the 4 stages, we're seeing many, many different applications and some even beyond the design process. But as we could see, for example, in the discover stage, we have summarization. So it's quite, it's really about condensing those research transcripts, documents, survey data, and actionable briefs. And you also have insight extractions, right? Really about identifying patterns, themes, and user needs. And so essentially in the discover stage, it's really about uncovering as much information and insight as possible from the given data set or beyond in order to understand better about your users that will help with the define stages. So at this define stage, we have persona generation. So really about synthesizing user personas and archetypes from research findings, And then you also have problem framing. So how we're clustering different problems, how we're articulating our problem statements, and designing opportunities from data. So include some companies that were either clustering between similar problems that were able to test instead of independently put together. Also in a way that they were able to compare to the competitors' data in order to save time and the effort in reaching out. Then you also have the develop stage. So developing the prototyping, it's really about creative ideation. So how you're able to generate service concepts, explore those different alternatives, and then going through that rapid brainstorming process. And I think it also speaks in the name that in this stage where it's really about generating things, right? We have prototyping. And so you have the different SD archetypes, which include, let's say, journey maps, blueprints, wireframes, or visual mockups. And finally, you have the deliver stage, which is really about how you're able to deliver your service and beyond. So some of the evaluation. So when it comes to content generation, you're drafting those SOPs, onboarding flows, and then communication touchpoints. You also have some scenario simulation. So how do you ensure that you're able to effectively deliver the services, right? That's through, for example, simulating service encounters, drafting and testing those edge cases before launch. And so what does it actually mean and how it actually translates into service design workflows? Well, on the top row, you could see the traditional kind of service design process across the 4 stages. So it's quite laborious, I would say, and it's quite a sequential kind of flow of events. So you start with the discover stage. Usually it's hours long of interviews. You're conducting field research. You're doing those stakeholder mappings and really to understand users at stake. And you also have defining, right? So you're defining and making those judgment calls, and then you're making those prioritization lists, and then framing the problems. And then you have developing. So once you've defined your target groups, target users, how do you develop your products or your services that tailor to them? So it's really about setting the direction, quality review, and doing all those checks. And finally, how you're maintaining that relationship as you go to deliver your service. And so we're seeing with generative AI, it's quite different, right? So across the 4 stages, we're seeing 4 major differences. So at the discover stage, we're seeing that it's able to now analyze large-scale unstructured data in order to uncover those patterns and latent leads. A lot of the times, these aren't able to be retrieved in standard workshops. And with those large-scale capabilities, you're able to then capture them either directly or indirectly. Then you have the define stage, so synthesizing diverse different data sources and perspectives in order to really understand the problem framing at stake in a codifiable format. And then you have develop, so it's really at the stage about rapidly generating quick prototypes that enables you to not only cut down the time that it takes to develop themselves, but also to test early. And finally, we have the deliver. So you're enabling now data-driven validation at scale through those various techniques, such as through simulated feedback. You also have predictive analytics. And so overall, I think it solves a lot of the problems that we're traditionally seeing in service design, one of which being that, sometimes it can be really hard to reach out to the right audience and to right users in conducting our testing early on in the process. So before getting started and really sharing about some of our preliminary findings, I do want to take some time for you to kind of reflect on your own. So feel free to use your devices and use the code that's displayed above. If you were to reflect and describe your organization's current approach to AI-enabled services, what would it be? Is it rather ad hoc? Is it experimenting? Or is it that you have a structured approach? Or maybe you're still figuring out if AI is relevant, which I believe that most of you won't be at that stage. So feel free to engage with the question. And I'll leave around 3 to 5 minutes for this. Feel free to also respond in the chat. Okay, so we're seeing some responses starting to come in. I think we'll leave for maybe another a minute or so before we move on to the next part. Great, so none of you is actually figuring out if AI is relevant, because I'm sure that it probably is to some extent. Great. Okay, and so really to investigate the problem further, what we did was that we interviewed around 40 practitioners across 8 major industries. And these people were of different roles, mostly in middle to higher senior executive roles. So these were people from service design. These people were from service design fields. There were also heads of AI, heads of innovation, heads of strategy. And the question that we asked really was, what were some of the problems that they encountered? What were some of the opportunities that they saw in their process of embedding AI and generative AI into their service design workflows and processes? And these were some of the results that we found. We derived 13 design principles across 4 major stages, which are exploration, creation, reflection, and then implementation. And due to time constraints, I'll only be sharing 2 DPs today, but if you're interested in understanding or learning more about these, feel free to reach out directly to me or to CSA. And so the first DP that I'm going to be talking about is DP number 2, which is on exploration. It's really about exploring how AI performs within real organizational conditions. This was a pattern that we saw over and over and over again across B2C and B2B settings. They're very similar, but also slightly different. So the example that we had from B2C was that they had a conversational AI agent for hotel bookings, right? And the problem was that, according to this individual we interviewed, was that AI was getting really confused on the intents. So for example, if a guest asks, can I book a room versus can you tell me about the rooms? These would require completely different responses, right? So if a guest asks, can I book a room? Most likely you want to redirect them to the reservation page. Whereas someone asks, can you tell me about the rooms? It's really about kind of facilitating and initiating that process that triggered them to making that purchasing decision. So they're completely different, but also in a way can be phrased quite similarly. And so one of the things that we found was that AI was really unable to tell the difference in terms of the intent. What they did was that throughout this process, they were generating over 50 test scenarios with GPT. They were manually testing against each with real hotel booking flows, only to discover that the intent confusion only surfaced when they were using real guest language. So GPT wasn't able to enable them to really surface the intent problem that they were seeing. This was very similar in B2B setting as well. So in this case, we have an IT service transformation. So the account director of this firm said that they were using a lot of manual effort correcting what Gen AI has given us, and then it dilutes the intention of using it altogether. What the problem really was that they had a deal that was structured for 100 people. In reality, it grew to 156 in real conditions. But then after applying generative AI layer by layer, they were able to reduce it to 78. So essentially what the problem was that they were only able to discover what the true capabilities were and how many people were required of it when they were going kind of against the live infrastructure. They enabled it to test what it really is under real scenarios, under real people, and under kind of real edge cases. And so I think in both of these cases, it's quite similar in a way that you really need to ground early on with real users, real data, and real edge cases, but at the same time, quite different in terms of the context that it takes. The second DP that I'll be talking about here is DP number 4, which is on co-creating with Gen AI as a thought partner. So what we found was that rather than treating Gen AI purely as a tool that executes your instructions, it's really about practitioners who are able to use it as a collaborative partner that were able to derive the most value from it, from the outputs, whether that's through challenging its suggestions, maybe elaborating on some of the context, or really kind of deepening on their understanding of certain concepts. So this is, again, slightly different, but also similar with B2C versus B2B contexts. So in B2B, we have a new service concept for career services. So this person says that they were gathering information from their experts and how they serve their customers and what the important factors were. They fed it to AI and asked it to help conceptualize a service. It says that when it knows the customer needs, you can ask it to come up with service ideas. Then at that point, you're able to shorten the ideation cycle. So when you're able to feed it with real customer data into AI, then its output starts as a starting point that works well for service conceptualization, which then leads to a compression of time of ideation within workshops. It's quite similar, but also different in B2B settings, because this time we're talking about really validating with the technical feasibility. So in this case, they were dropping API docs into the GPT. They were asking the question of, okay, can these APIs really help them perform all these features, like canceling a booking or sending a voucher? So in this case, we're no longer kind of conceptually a new idea based on our customer information, but rather we're looking at how we're able to technically test it without going through the developer meeting that would usually take a very long time. And so I think in both of these examples, you're able to see how generative AI is able to co-create with you as a partner that spans and then enables you to co-create value through the interaction. And so I wanted to do another quick reflection. Again, feel free to respond in the chat, but also you could also respond to Mentimeter if that's more that's more suitable for you. So out of the 2 DBs that we've mentioned, you could answer or choose to answer one of these questions. And if you're not part of an organization, feel free to respond to the last question, which is on when using AI to brainstorm or solve ideas, what steps do you take to remain the primary decision maker? So really, again, think of an organization or an AI-enabled service your organization has deployed or is planning to deploy, and respond to these questions. And due to time, we're not going to have too much time here, but I still want to give you a chance to quickly reflect based on the DBs that we've talked about. So give 2 more minutes before I move on to the final piece of the presentation. Okay, and with that, I want to wrap up the session with talking about some of the research and practice that we've been doing collectively with our industrial partners. So we define kind of 2 streams of service design. We have the design for services, which is really about designing the conditions for AI transformation. We're taking a step back and looking at an organization as a whole. So how do they create the governance, the structure, and strategic alignment that enable generative AI to take shape, in service delivery, in service design, and to create value? And we also have design of services, which is on what practitioners are actually building. These are talking about insights from the ground, including real use cases, emerging methods, and what service design essentially looks like in practice. And so with that, I'm going to end my session and open up for any questions that you may have.